Hey guys, welcome to Mind Over Modo. Today we're continuing our crash course introduction to scripting in Modo. In the first lesson, I showed you how to create the script and how to save it in the Modo scripts folder for easy access. I also showed you where to find these panels that will help us as we move forward in developing the script. In this next lesson, I'm going to show you how to get information out of Modo that you can manipulate inside of your script. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to head back over to the script that we ended with in the last lesson, and I'm going to go ahead and save that out as a different name, making a copy of it. I'm going to call it get items, because that's what we're going to be doing in this lesson. So save that out. And I want to start by showing you a new command that we're going to be using a lot, and it's lx.eval. And this is kind of a catch-all command for getting information from Modo and sending commands to Modo for Modo to execute. So if we want to get information from Modo, we run what is called a query command. So I'm going to show you a query command for getting the number of items in a Modo scene. So in quotes, we're going to type in query for a query command, scene service, which is the service that we're going to use to retrieve this information with. There's some different services as a part of the LX group of libraries, and we're going to use scene service. And then the query we're going to send is item.in, and then you put a question mark, space question mark, to signify that you're running a query as well. Now, if I run this, it will run that command, but I need to assign the value of this query back to a variable in my script. So we'll just call this item num. And now by setting that variable equal to this query, when it returns the number, it will assign it to this variable, and then I can do something with it. So the last thing I want to do in this step is put that variable item num into our lx.out command to check and see if it's doing what I want. So I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to go back to Modo, go down here to our command line, and use our @ syntax like we did before, @get items.py, hit return, and we can see over here that that worked. We returned 20 was the number, and it came back and it returned it to our variable item num and sent it out to the event log just fine. So we can see that that's working good, and now we have a starting point for building the rest of the script. Now you may be asking yourself, why don't I just execute a query command that returns all the items from the Modo scene directly? And the answer is that as far as I've been able to find, there is not a command, a query command, that does that in the old fire and forget scripting for Modo. That's changed with 901 and the TD-SDK, but that's not what I'm using here. So I'm going to have to use some scripting to actually build that list on my own. So let's look and see how we can do that. To build a list in Python, I can create an empty variable called item list, put on the equal sign, and then open and close bracket. Now that just makes a variable that is a type that is an array, or you can think of it as a list. So what I want to do is for every item in the Modo scene, I want to go and get the name of that item, and I want to put it in this list. So that means we need Python to repeat a series of commands over and over and again for the amount of items that are in the scene, in this case 20 times. So what we do in this case like this is we create what's called a loop. So Python has a special way to loop through items in a list. But as you can see, I just have a single number here representing the items in the scene, not a list. So before I can populate this list here, I actually am going to make another list called item num list. And I need to construct a list that is basically a list of the numbers from 0 to the total number of items in the scene. In this case, 20. So a list would look like this: 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 20. All right. So there is a Python command that will do that for us. And it is called range. If we type in range and then the number 0 as our starting point and item num as our endpoint, this variable here that we got from the scene, it will create a list that starts at the number 0 and ends at the number 19. Now you may say, well, why 19? We want 20. We got 20 back from this. Well, 0 to 19 equals 20 entries. And probably the easiest way to show you that is to just run it in the script. So I'm going to go ahead and start to make the loop. To do that, we type in for. We type in the name of the variable that we want to use for getting access to the list entry that we're currently on. So I'm just going to call it item. And then we type in the word in, and then the name of the list. In this case, item num list. So if that was confusing when I was explaining it, what this basically says is that we're going to go through item num list, and for each entry, we're going to assign that entry to the variable item. And then we can access that inside the loop to do things that we need to do. Now, in a for loop, the actions that you want to execute in that loop have to be tabbed in. So for right now, all I want to do is I'm just going to cut, paste this lx out. All I want to do is just make sure that the loop is working correctly, that our item num list is working correctly, and we're looping through it correctly. So I'm just going to type in item here. So if that works how I want it to, we'll loop through item number list or item num list from 0 to 19, and we will print. This will print that number out. So let's give that a try. We're going to go back to Modo and get items py. I've already run it here before, so I can click in the undos tab. I can just double click on it to run it instead of having to type it, which is kind of nice. So if I double click on that, we'll see here that that loop is working and it's printing out the numbers 0 to 19. So if you count starting at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, you'll see that we're one ahead of the entry. And so 19 will actually be 20. And that's how arrays work. They start at 0, so they're always one number off. But the range command is handling that for us, which is really, really nice. So now I need to use that to drive another query command. The query command I'm going to use is going to retrieve the item ID, which is Modo's internal name for the items in the scene. So I'm going to call this item ID, and I'm going to use lx.eval again. Open, close parentheses, go back inside, open, close quote, type in query, scene service, item. This time we type .id, question mark. Now the difference here with this query command is I can pass it an index, which just means a number representing the number that the item is in the scene, like the item number 1, the item number 2, and it will return me the ID name. So I need to insert this variable into that command string. How am I going to get this variable into here? If I just type item, it's just going to pass the literal word item into this command, and that's not what we want. We want to pass the number that we saw printed out in the event log earlier. So the way that you do that in Python is you type %s, and then outside of the quote, space, %, and the name of the variable, in this case, item. Now, what this is going to do, this line will take the value of the variable item, so one of the numbers, and it'll insert it right here in this command. And if that works correctly, it'll retrieve the item ID name for that entry in the item list in the Modo scene, and it will assign it to this variable. So let's test that out. I'm just going to change that lx.out to item ID. And if it works correctly, we should see a list of item ID names come up. Let's go back over here and double click to execute the script. And it worked. There you go. We can see that we have all these item ID names coming up in the event log. And you can kind of tell what they are because of how they're named. The next thing that we need to do in the script is add a line that will start to add these items to this item list that I created. So first of all, I'm going to make sure I create this. I'm going to cut paste and create this up here before I start the loop. Otherwise the loop won't know what to use when I refer to it in the loop. And then I'm going to type in item list dot append parenthesis, open close parenthesis. And this is the Python command you use to add an item to the list. So all we have to do is pass in the variable item ID. And now every time it goes through the loop, it will add the item ID name to this list that I'm making called item list. So now to make sure that's working, I'm going to cut that lx out and go outside the loop. So I just go over here real quick and pull the tab out of there. And now I'm going to type in item list. So I'm going to see if this shows up and has those names in it, then we'll know it's working correctly. And let's go ahead and test that now. Go back over to Modo, double click the command. And there we go. We can see it's working. It looks different than this, which is good. So it's not just doing what we did here. This is actually showing us that list because it's in brackets and each of these names is in quotes. So we can tell that that is actually returning the contents of that list. All right, so that is basically the goal of what we wanted to accomplish with this lesson number 2. In lesson number 3, I'm going to show you how you can take this list that you've made and use it to get access to the items in the Modo scene and do something with those items. In this case, I'm going to change their names. So if you have any questions, type that in the comments of this video. Feel free to like and subscribe to the channel if you want. And I hope to see you in lesson number 3.